The Vietnam War protests. At first, Vietnam was controlled by the French and called the French Indochina. In 1930, a man named Ho Chi Minh introduced the first Communist Party of Vietnam. Then, due to the outbreak of war, the Japanese declared Vietnam and the surrounding countries, such as Cambodia and Laos, to be independent. Eventually, Ho Chi Minh took advantage of that and separated North Vietnam from the South by the 17th parallel line. And of course, in fear of the domino effect, in true American fashion, we created the Truman Doctrine and sent troops to Vietnam to battle communism. An attack on the USS Maddox led to JFK and Congress sending troops to Vietnam. However, as the US drafted more and more men to fight, the protests grew. Protests against the war grew, Okay, two terms to know are hawks and doves, those for and against the war. Hawks supported the war and believed that U.S. involvement in Vietnam was a positive thing, while doves were the opposite and protested the war. This is a song named Masters of War by Bob Dylan.
Come, you masters of war.
You can listen to the rest later. I don't really have a lot of space. Bob Dylan was a very well-known dove, and he was a key figure in the counterculture of the era. And counterculture is best defined as subcultures that go against the mainstream ideology in society in general. An example includes the beatniks of the 50s, who listened to jazz and practiced Buddhism. Another example is the hippies of the 60s that took part in psychedelic drugs, wore colorful clothing, and protested for peace. Some key figures include Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and of course Bob Dylan. Different people protested in different ways. Teach-ins were designed to educate and inform the public of the injustices of the war. Meanwhile, sit-ins took on a more violent approach, such as when Cornell students locked Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in a car. Why was there so much opposition? Well, people opposed the war in correspondence to the civil rights movement. A key point that Muhammad Ali actually supported was, why should they be obligated to fight for others in a country overseas while people of color were being mistreated right here at home in the USA? Also, the hippies reflected on the fact that war is immoral, while others simply believed that the war was just an excuse to expand American influence in Asia rather than moral reasons and making the world safe for democracy. Some notable protests and movement included marches in D.C. and sit-ins where people, such as veterans even, participated by throwing down their uniforms and badges. Most of the protests were organized by SDS, a student-led organization. There were also protests for the war, such as the one that took place in Washington, D.C. in 1970. Here's a clip from that.
Thousands of demonstrators opposed to the Vietnam War assembled in the nation's capital for a mass protest. For the most part orderly, minor scuffles did occur between the demonstrators and hecklers. A 3-hour parade takes the demonstrators across the Potomac on their way to the Pentagon. The crowd, estimated at about 50,000 persons, was a loose confederation of some 150 groups and included adults, students, even children. It is at the Pentagon where the first test of strength comes.
As for the government, President Nixon basically highlighted on multiple occasions that he wants to end the war, and that's actually how he was elected in the first place. And he did eventually withdraw all troops in 1970. He was very slow, which aggravated many of the protesters. And what made them even more outraged was that 2 weeks after he withdrew all troops, the U.S. invaded Cambodia on April 30th, 1970. After Kent State, which I'll talk about more later, Nixon decided to join the protesters in front of the Lincoln Memorial. There, he spoke to everyone about school and everything that was going on, and he explained that his goals were the same as theirs. It's just that things aren't happening as quick as they want things to happen, and he apologized, but he also said that change isn't going to happen as fast as they want. Police brutality against college protests was unfortunately a big part of the 60s. For example, when we invaded Cambodia, it led to colleges such as Kent State University in Ohio protesting the war. Eventually, the National Guard was sent to the college, where they opened fire, and 4 people were killed with 9 injured. Some refer to this specific event as the downfall of Nixon's presidency, and 9 days later, a similar event took place in Mississippi at Jackson State University. Of the majority black students, 2 were killed and 12 were injured. Meanwhile, at Berkeley in California, students organized sit-ins where they sang, studied, and hung out at the school late into the night. One night in 1965, police came and arrested almost 800 people. Vietnam was the first ever televised war, which led to the media depicting the war in pretty negative lights, and some believe that the pessimistic views of the media is what led to American defeat. However, others argue that the media only depicted what most Americans already felt, and there was no changing that, no matter how much the media tried. By the mid-70s, Nixon resigned after his involvement in the Watergate scandal, and unfortunately, Vietnam unified as a communist state. Protests have been around for a while. In fact, that is what our country was founded on, the principle that everyone has the freedom of speech, and, complain until you get what you want. Some protests today include Bangladesh Quota Reform Movement, which is essentially students protesting the policies, the draft and recruitment policies for services. March for Our Lives, where students protest the fact that we don't have strong gun laws in response to the growing numbers of mass shootings, especially in schools. And the March for Life, which is basically a protest against the legality of abortions, and saying that it should be illegal to kill children while they are in their mother's womb. These are my sources.